The village of Dalton is more than $3.5 million in the hole. Mayor Tiffany Henyard is accused of misusing money, and today she's nowhere to be found.
Very, very diligently, very hard under difficult circumstances to get as much information as we could to share with you.
She thinks she's going to jail. I'm also a former Cook County Sheriff for the Department of Correction, and I suggest that she go and take a tour of that facility so she can see what.
Mayor Tiffany Henyard of Dalton, Illinois, has found herself at the center of a political storm, with allegations of corruption, misconduct, and poor leadership threatening to unravel her already unstable political career. Henyard's rise to power was anything but conventional. After the sudden death of Mayor Frank Zuccarelli, Dalton's Board of Trustees was tasked with selecting a replacement to finish his term. However, the selection process was chaotic, and with time running out, Trustee Christopher Gonzalez nominated Henyard, a largely unknown figure at the time. This rushed nomination raised suspicions that her appointment was more about political maneuvering than merit, leading many in Dalton to question the legitimacy of her selection at her first official meeting as mayor. Henyard promised to serve the people of Dalton with fiscal responsibility and dedication, echoing the vows made by her late predecessor. However, it didn't take long for her leadership to be marked by tension, poor decision-making, and a growing animosity toward those who helped her rise to power. Her tenure quickly became defined by an authoritarian leadership style, a disregard for collaboration, and a lack of effective communication with other town officials. One of her first major actions as mayor was to dismiss key figures such as Jessica Jones and Stephanie Whitman, moves that many perceived as politically motivated rather than based on merit. These abrupt firings raised suspicions of internal power struggles and political infighting within the town's leadership. Henyard's interactions with other elected officials also grew increasingly erratic. One of the most alarming incidents occurred when Henyard reportedly locked Township Assessor Cassandra Stone out of her office during a heated dispute, further raising concerns about her temperament and ability to lead. The situation took a darker turn when Stone, along with another official, discovered piles of confidential documents carelessly scattered in a common area outside Henyard's office. These documents, containing sensitive personal information such as names, addresses, social security numbers, and health data, belonged to residents seeking assistance with tax exemptions and property assessments. The mishandling of these documents raised serious questions about Henyard's competence in managing the town's affairs and her ability to protect the privacy of Dalton citizens. As Henyard's political career continued to spiral, tensions with the public and fellow officials grew more pronounced. Allegations of corruption, financial mismanagement, and personal vendettas began to surface, with many accusing her of using her position to settle scores and pursue her interests rather than serving the people of Dalton. Amidst mounting legal and investigative pressures, Henyard's grip on power began to weaken, but her defiant attitude only seemed to exacerbate the situation. Despite widespread criticism, she refused to step down, insisting that she was a victim of a political conspiracy aimed at undermining her leadership. However, many Dalton residents were unconvinced by her claims, with growing doubts about whether her actions were driven by a genuine desire to serve the community or by a reckless ambition to consolidate power at all costs. The corruption scandal surrounding Henyard sparked outrage, with calls for accountability growing louder by the day. Reports soon emerged that the FBI had launched investigations into Henyard's financial dealings, with rumors of embezzlement and misuse of public funds adding fuel to the fire. Henyard's approval ratings plummeted, and public trust in her leadership became virtually non-existent as investigations into her conduct intensified. Henyard's future as mayor appeared increasingly uncertain. The people of Dalton were left wondering whether her scandal-ridden tenure would mark the end of her political career, or she would somehow manage to weather the storm and retain her hold on power despite the mounting pressure amidst growing scrutiny and controversy surrounding her leadership. Henyard's administration faced yet another scandal. This time, concerns were raised about the sudden relocation of the assessor's office and a lack of official documentation justifying the move. Henyard's response was dismissive, claiming the relocation was necessary due to the heat impeding her ability to work. However, her critics were unconvinced, especially since no formal announcement had been made nor any clear explanation provided for such a significant change. Despite the growing public backlash, Henyard continued to defend the decision, framing it as part of a broader effort to prioritize citizen services. Many residents, however, saw this justification as weak and insincere, especially as dissatisfaction with Henyard's leadership continued to grow. What made matters worse was the reaction from Henyard supporters. Rather than rallying behind her, some began to make their pointed criticisms. One supporter suggested that local media should shift focus away from criticizing the township's management and instead celebrate the township's receipt of the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. This attempt to shift the narrative from criticism to praise was seen as an empty diversion. As the community's discontent could not be so easily dismissed by claims of success, Henyard's responses to the mounting criticism took increasingly bizarre and unconvincing turns, blending defensive arguments with spiritual overtones, which only alienated more residents. In public statements, she framed her struggles as a moral test, using phrases that seemed more suited to a religious sermon than a political defense. Her refusal to acknowledge the severity of the situation, coupled with her increasingly erratic rhetoric, only deepened the public's frustration, and distrust of tension escalated further when Henyard's unconventional ally, Keith Freeman, took a more aggressive stance. Freeman publicly rebuked the media for its portrayal of Henyard, dismissing critical stories as nothing more than hit pieces. He urged others to celebrate Henyard's leadership and ignore the ongoing criticisms. This attempt to shift the conversation only fueled the growing sense of alienation among residents who felt that Henyard's administration was becoming increasingly detached from the realities they were facing as the investigation into her financial dealings and leadership practices deepens. The political future of Mayor Tiffany Henyard looks increasingly bleak. The people of Dalton are left wondering whether Henyard can weather the storm or if her scandal-ridden tenure will finally lead to her downfall. The political crisis continues to unfold, and with each new revelation, Henyard's grip on power becomes weaker. While public calls for accountability grow louder, Mayor Tiffany Henyard's tenure in Dalton, Illinois, has devolved into a chaotic and turbulent saga marked by legal battles, controversies, and overwhelming public outrage. Initially elected with promises of progress and reform, Henyard's leadership quickly became overshadowed by accusations of corruption, financial mismanagement, and an utter disregard for transparency, leaving the community disillusioned and distrustful. Her rise to power was itself a strange and rushed affair. After the unexpected death of former Mayor Frank Zuccarelli, the Dalton Board of Trustees faced pressure to quickly appoint a new leader, despite being a late entrant to the race. Henyard was nominated and swiftly voted into office. However, this process was far from smooth. Many residents believe her appointment was more about political maneuvering than merit, setting the stage for the controversies that would follow almost immediately after assuming office. Henyard's leadership was marked by questionable decisions that raised doubts about her ability to lead effectively. One of her first major mistakes was hiring a criminal inspector without consulting the Board of Trustees, which alarmed many and raised concerns about her respect for the proper governance channels. To make matters worse, Henyard enlisted Dalton police officers to provide her with personal security, a decision that many saw as a clear conflict of interest, blurring the lines between her public office and private life. These early actions triggered skepticism about her ability to make responsible, fair decisions. Many began to question whether Henyard was truly suited to lead the town as her time in office continued. The controversies surrounding Henyard only grew more serious. During a township meeting, resident GIS sharply criticized Henyard for failing to engage the community in key decisions. GIS pointed to the mental health tax proposal, which had been rejected by voters, as an example of Henyard's failure to listen to the people. Henyard had promised greater civic engagement during her campaign, but had ignored the voices of the very people she had pledged to serve. This growing disconnect between her campaign promises and her actions created increasing frustration within the community. The rift between Henyard and her supporters began to widen. Some of her early backers, like Trinidad, spoke out against her leadership, accusing her of gross mismanagement, unprofessional behavior, and even misconduct during official trips. Additionally, Trinidad alleged that Henyard had excluded key board members from important meetings and had made decisions without consulting anyone, further eroding trust in her administration. These criticisms deepened the divide between Henyard and those around her, including members of her board. The lack of cooperation between Henyard and fellow officials fueled an increasingly hostile environment within the local government, as if tensions weren't already high. Henyard's administration became entangled in a series of lawsuits, each one compounding the difficulties she faced. Legal battles, coupled with growing distrust from the community and local leaders, significantly weakened her position. The constant legal challenges served as a stark reminder of Henyard's declining political power, yet she continued to press forward with little regard for the consequences. Her increasingly unstable position within the local government, coupled with her refusal to acknowledge the mounting criticism, left her isolated and embattled. The community that had once placed their trust in her leadership now grappled with the reality that their mayor was failing to meet the expectations they had for her. Public frustration continued to grow, and Henyard's approval ratings sank to new lows. Despite her faltering leadership, Henyard maintained a defiant stance. When public criticism reached a fever pitch, Henyard began holding private meetings and restricting media access, further fueling perception that she was deliberately avoiding responsibility. When reporters were eventually allowed into some of these meetings, they often found themselves abruptly cut off, leaving the impression that Henyard was actively evading questions about her administration's failures. One of Henyard's most vocal defenders, Keith Freeman, remained steadfast in his support. Freeman insisted that no misconduct had occurred and accused the media of focusing on gossip and rumors rather than the township's achievements. He dismissed critics as either ignorant or malicious, yet this did little to quell the growing concerns among Dalton residents. To reassure the public, Freeman even offered visual proof to show that no private information or documents had been mishandled during the office move. However, these assurances failed to quell the larger concerns about Henyard's leadership. The relocation of the assessor's office, which Henyard had initially claimed was part of an effort to enhance citizen services, came to symbolize a broader issue: a lack of transparency, decision-making without due process, and a failure to involve the community in important decisions. The more Henyard attempted to defend her actions, the more her responses appeared defensive and unconvincing. She framed her struggles as part of a moral or spiritual test, evoking spiritual language to portray herself as a victim of divine trials. Freeman even went so far as to claim, "God doesn't make mistakes. He put the right person here who knows how to do the work, take the lashes, and have the strength to endure it all." This attempt to frame Henyard's troubles as part of a divine plan did little to convince the public, especially given the lack of transparency and accountability in her leadership. Many residents saw her rhetoric as an excuse for her inability to confront the real problems facing the town at a critical public meeting. Henyard's leadership was further scrutinized. One reporter revealed how Henyard's administration had repeatedly denied media access to important meetings, with Henyard herself dismissing their concerns. "You don't want to do the research," she told the reporters. "You keep listening to people who are feeding you fiction, fake news. Stop and go check the facts if you want to know the truth, so you can understand what we're fighting over." Her combative stance and refusal to engage constructively only deepened the divide between her and the people she was supposed to serve. Henyard's framing of her difficulties as part of higher calling alienated many of Dalton's residents. Her repeated references to spiritual warfare only created a sense of distance between herself and the citizens, who felt she was unwilling or unable to confront the real challenges facing their town. She continued to insist that the problems were external forces at work, rather than a result of her mismanagement. This made it increasingly clear that she was either unaware of or indifferent to the growing dissatisfaction in the community as Henyard's leadership continued to unravel. The people of Dalton were left questioning whether the promises of reform and progress she made during her campaign would ever be realized. Her administration had become synonymous with dysfunction, mismanagement, and a failure to address the issues that mattered most to residents. The public's frustration only grew as Henyard's refusal to take responsibility and her increasingly erratic behavior isolated her further from the community. Henyard's tenure, once seen as a potential new chapter for Dalton, became a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, poor decision-making, and a leadership style that failed to meet the needs of the people she was supposed to serve. Her promises of transparency and civic engagement were abandoned in favor of defensive rhetoric and evasion. Legal battles continued to pile up, further diminishing her political credibility. What was once a promising political career now seemed destined for a tragic, scandal-ridden end. The saga of Tiffany Henyard's time as mayor has turned from one of hope and potential to a story of public disappointment, legal entanglements, and governmental dysfunction. With each passing day, the future of her political career grows more uncertain. As the community grapples with the fallout from her administration's failures, Henyard's legacy is being written as one of controversy, scandal, and the erosion of public trust. Her time in office has ultimately become a testament to the dangers of power without accountability, and the people of Dalton are left searching for answers as they begin to rebuild after a turbulent reign. Tiffany Henyard's time as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, has spiraled into a deeply scandalous and turbulent period, leaving the community in a state of disarray and distrust. The mounting legal battles, allegations of financial misconduct, and growing public backlash have threatened to unravel her leadership and tarnish her legacy. What began with promises of change and progress has now become a cautionary tale of poor decision-making, financial mismanagement, and an utter disregard for accountability and transparency in government. One of the most notable legal battles that contributed to Henyard's unraveling was a lawsuit filed by a Dalton police officer who had been part of Henyard's personal security detail. The officer alleged that Henyard had misused city resources to provide security for herself, raising serious concerns about her financial stewardship and how taxpayer money was being spent. The accusation not only pointed to potential abuse of power, but also shed light on Henyard's questionable priorities, Particularly given Dalton's already fragile financial situation, the legal troubles didn't stop there. Another lawsuit was filed by Dwayne Thrash, a former maintenance manager, who claimed he had been wrongfully terminated. Thrash alleged that Henyard fired him under pretenses, citing insubordination and poor performance, even though he was on authorized leave at the time. His suit further alleged violations of his First and 14th Amendment rights, underscoring Henyard's apparent disregard for legal procedures and due process. These lawsuits were just the beginning, as a growing number of legal challenges began to compound the pressure surrounding her administration. As these lawsuits piled up, many of Henyard's critics began accusing her of using her position of power to silence political opponents and critics. It became clear that anyone who dared to challenge her actions was subject to retaliation, whether through legal threats, termination, or being excluded from key decisions. This created a toxic political environment within Dalton's local government, where fear and distrust replaced cooperation and accountability. The legal turmoil surrounding Henyard soon attracted the attention of federal authorities. In a move that highlighted the severity of the situation, former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot was hired to investigate Henyard's conduct at a rate of $400 per hour. Lightfoot's investigation primarily focused on Henyard's lavish spending habits, particularly her use of taxpayer funds for personal indulgences, such as expensive meals, hotel stays, and extravagant travel. One of the most notorious examples of Henyard's financial mismanagement was a trip to Las Vegas, where it was reported that she spent $26,000 in taxpayer funds. This excessive expenditure came at a time when Dalton's financial situation was dire, and many residents were struggling with the effects of the town's fiscal troubles. Henyard's decision to use public money for such personal luxuries raised serious concerns not only about her priorities, but also about her ability to manage public resources effectively in response to the growing scrutiny. Henyard claimed that the investigation into her spending was racially motivated, arguing that she was being targeted because of her identity as a black woman in a position of power. She framed the investigation as an attempt to undermine her leadership, using race as a shield to deflect attention from the real issues at hand: her misuse of public funds and her failure to be accountable for her actions. However, her defense did little to sway the growing dissatisfaction from the public. Many Dalton residents saw her racial arguments as a transparent attempt to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. Henyard's absence from a recent Dalton Village Board of Trustees meeting only fueled suspicions and deepened the divide between her administration and the community. As the investigation continued, the people of Dalton became more frustrated with her refusal to acknowledge the mounting evidence of her misconduct. Federal investigators, meanwhile, were delving deeper into Henyard's financial dealings, uncovering troubling revelations about her use of taxpayer dollars. Among the most concerning discoveries was a revelation that nearly $900,000 had been paid to a local prosecutor over 2 years, despite the prosecutor's inability to generate any criminal charges. This raised serious questions about potential corruption and how public resources were being misused to benefit individuals close to Henyard. As the investigation progressed, the scope of the corruption appeared to extend beyond Henyard herself, with federal authorities turning their attention to her inner circle, including her political committee, her cancer charity, her boyfriend, and several trustees, 2 of whom were believed to be her relatives. Federal subpoenas were issued to these individuals, demanding records related to payroll data, expenses, employment reimbursements, credit card statements, travel details, and other documents that were now being carefully reviewed by a grand jury. The investigation uncovered multiple layers of alleged corruption, with key figures within Henyard's administration, including her deputy police chief, also being named in the subpoenas. Questions even emerged about Henyard's involvement in a defunct burger business, adding yet another layer of intrigue to the growing web of corruption surrounding her leadership. At the center of the scandal was Henyard's top aide, Keith Freeman, who was facing bankruptcy fraud charges. Freeman was accused of failing to disclose Dalton's revenues. An audit revealed that Freeman had received payments exceeding the approved budget during his time in office. Despite these allegations, Freeman continued to hold positions of power in both Dalton and Thoron Township, leading to speculation that his legal team might be negotiating with federal investigators in exchange for his cooperation. The investigation was still ongoing, and former FBI agents suggested that additional evidence, informants, and witnesses could come to light as the case progressed, deepening the scrutiny on Henyard and her associates. As the investigation intensified, Henyard's position as mayor became increasingly untenable. She continued to deny any wrongdoing, labeling the accusations against her as politically motivated and racially charged attacks aimed at discrediting her leadership. In a particularly controversial moment, Henyard claimed that her fellow trustees, many of whom were black, should feel ashamed of themselves for attacking a black woman in a position of authority. This inflammatory response only alienated the community further and seemed to underscore her growing disconnect from the very people she was supposed to represent. Henyard's continued defiant defense of her actions, combined with the mounting evidence against her, led to widespread calls for accountability. One of the most glaring examples of her financial mismanagement came to light when it was revealed that she had racked up more than $112,000 in taxpayer-funded travel expenses over a single year. This included first class, airfare and stays at luxurious hotels like the Four Seasons in Atlanta and the Marriott Marquis in New York City. One of her hotel stays alone reportedly cost an astounding $133,000, which many residents found particularly egregious given Dalton's financial struggles. Her extravagant spending habits seemed both irresponsible and self-serving, especially considering the town's limited resources. Public funds, which should have been used to improve the lives of Dalton residents, were instead being used to indulge Henyard's personal preferences. This blatant misuse of taxpayer dollars only fueled the sense of betrayal and frustration among Dalton's residents. Her continued high salary, despite the mounting issues facing the town, only deepened the sense that Henyard had become disconnected from the community's needs despite her best efforts to frame herself as a victim of political retaliation and personal attacks. Henyard's defense was met with growing skepticism, as the federal investigation into her finances continued to expose troubling details about her spending and questionable decisions. The pressure on Henyard to step down intensified. Public calls for accountability became louder, with Dalton residents demanding that their elected officials face the consequences of their actions and restore transparency and trust in the local government. The investigation now focused on uncovering the full extent of Henyard's corruption and financial mismanagement, cast a dark shadow over her administration. While it remained unclear whether Henyard would face criminal charges, it was evident that her leadership had come to an end. The people of Dalton, who once supported Henyard's promises of reform and change, now found themselves grappling with the aftermath of her failures as the federal investigation continued to unfold. The people of Dalton remained hopeful that justice would eventually be served. They were determined to recover from the financial damage caused by Henyard's actions and restore faith in local governance. The scandal that once seemed to promise change had instead exposed deep flaws in the town's leadership. The people of Dalton, frustrated by Henyard's erratic leadership and poor decision-making, now longed for a government that was transparent, accountable, and responsible with taxpayer dollars. They hoped that this dark chapter in Dalton's history would lead to meaningful reforms and ensure that future leaders would be held to the highest standards of public service and accountability. In the wake of Henyard's scandal, it became increasingly clear that the residents of Dalton were demanding the kind of accountable, transparent leadership they deserved. As investigations continued and new revelations came to light, it was evident that Henyard's political career and the trust she once held within the community had all but collapsed.